Casting is an extremely important part of any TV series, because if you cast the wrong actor in a pivotal role, especially the lead, it risks ruining the entire series forevermore, no matter how good it might otherwise be. These 10 shows certainly didn't have that problem though, quite the opposite in fact. While few people would dare question these outstanding TV performances, it's just a shame they were left stranded in awful shows that absolutely didn't deserve them. From adaptations of existing IP that flat out missed the mark, to original procedural series that failed to make a dent, these shows were all fortunate enough to secure the talents of an incredible actor in a major role. And despite how poor the show was otherwise, the actor in question gave everything they had to their performance, enough that they might have compelled some on-the-fence viewers to stick it out regardless. And so, with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture here with 10 awesome performances trapped in terrible TV shows. Number 10. Lance Reddick in Resident Evil. Netflix's recent Resident Evil series really was just awful, wasn't it? Though somewhat ambitiously attempting to do something quite different with the IP, the series ultimately strayed far enough from the source material as to basically feel like a generic sci-fi horror series with the Resident Evil branding cynically slapped on it. Despite strong production values for the most part, the storytelling was an elongated, convoluted mess, failing both as its own story and a half-baked attempt to slot into the existing Resident Evil lore. The single saving grace was the great Lance Reddick, who despite the dud show he was ensnared within, acted his arse off as this new iteration of villain Albert Wesker. While some of the things the show does with Wesker are major head-scratchers, if not unintentionally hilarious, Reddick is the glue scarcely keeping it all watchable. In a better show, he could have easily become the definitive live-action version of Wesker, against admittedly slim competition, but instead he's the only truly laudable aspect of this train wreck. Unsurprisingly, given the vocal fan backlash, Resident Evil was cancelled by Netflix after a single season. Number 9. Jessica Henwick in Iron Fist. Netflix's Marvel shows were a massively mixed bag on the whole, and Iron Fist was generally accepted to be the worst of the lot, especially in its dreadful first season. The problem? First and foremost, the show failed to make its titular hero Danny Rand a particularly compelling character, while the 13-episode first season was an absolute slog due to terrible pacing and an overabundance of saggy, uninteresting subplots. But perhaps worst of all, the action sequences were routinely awful, shot without any filmmaking flair whatsoever and too often resorting to choppy editing to try and make things appear more exciting. Yet, critics and fans alike were united in singling out a single successful aspect of the series, Jessica Henwick's stellar performance as martial artist Colleen Wing. Both in terms of her dramatic chops and physicality in the show's action scenes, Henwick proved to be considerably more likeable and interesting than Danny Rand, enough that some questioned why she wasn't just cast as Iron Fist in the first place. Despite the general fan love for Henwick's work on the show though, the actress doesn't seem all that enthusiastic to reprise the role in potential future MCU projects. Number 8. James Spader in The Blacklist. You might not have been aware, but the James Spader starring crime thriller series The Blacklist is still going, with its 10th season set to air early next year. Yet try and find a review for the show that doesn't mention how this dead ordinary procedural series is held aloft sorely by the sheer acting gravitas of James Spader, who plays protagonist Raymond Red Reddington. Though it was entertainingly pulpy for a season or two, the ratings soon enough began to nosedive amid declining interest, and by the time it reached season 5, even most TV critics had given up bothering to review it. A show with writing this campy yet labyrinthine isn't really conducive to a long tenure, and so with almost 200 episodes to its name, The Blacklist has become increasingly tough to give much of a damn about. It's jumped the shark several times over the years and has nothing left to offer in the way of genuinely compelling mysteries. But Spader is a class act who gives it his all each and every week, even if it's easy to lament that he's spent so much of his career working on something so utterly undeserving of his talents. Number 7. Mustafa Shakir in Cowboy Bebop. Netflix's Cowboy Bebop series is perhaps the single biggest, most crushing TV disappointment in recent years, considering how long fans have been waiting for the beloved anime to get a mega-budget live-action adaptation. Basically, every aspect of the production was a letdown, from the wonky writing to the casting of almost all the main characters. Sorry, John Cho. The action sequence and even the general production values. Yet fans routinely singled out just one actor for giving a performance worthy of the source material, and that's Mustafa Shakir, who brought vibrant life to the role of Spike's partner Jet Black. Shakir stole basically every scene he was in, and while very little here feels like the anime done right, he absolutely knocked Jet Black out of the park. In fact, if anyone ever attempts another live-action adaptation, they'd be daft not to cast Shakir in the role again. Given the brutal viewership drop-off after the first week, it was simply a foregone conclusion that Cowboy Bebop would be cancelled, as it was less than a month after its release. Number 6. John Malkovich in Space Force. In terms of big-budget sitcoms released in recent years, few have been as disappointing as Netflix's Space Force, which was developed by the creator of The US Office, Greg Daniels, along with Steve Carell. Despite boasting a solid enough politically tinged premise and a cracking ensemble cast, including Carell, John Malkovich, Ben Schwartz, Fred Willard, and Lisa Kudrow, it was categorically a show that, wait for it, failed to launch. Though its second season was certainly an incremental improvement, the writing was shockingly low on wit given the pedigree behind it, ensuring it never rose above being a totally forgettable, soulless streaming sitcom. The only saving grace, however, was Malkovich, whose performance as Space Force's surly chief scientist Dr. Adrian Mallory could have won him an Emmy in a show with stronger writing. If the role of the bitter skeptic isn't exactly a huge stretch for Malkovich, he was the absolute beating heart of the show and stole every single scene he appeared in, which was thankfully a lot. To the surprise of not a single living soul, Space Force was recently cancelled by Netflix shortly after the release of its second season. Number 5. Cynthia Nixon in And Just Like That. The recent Sex and the City revival, And Just Like That, certainly had the potential to offer up an intriguing postscript to the hit HBO series, yet ultimately failed to capitalise on that promise. First and foremost, the absence of Kim Cattrall's Samantha left a huge gaping void in the show that it simply failed to fill with a bevy of uninteresting new characters. Plus, in an attempt to update the show's original formula for contemporary tastes, the writing ill-advisedly focused on the middle-aged lady struggling to keep up in an increasingly woke world, which is even more cringe-inducing than it sounds. And yet, just as Cynthia Nixon was the easy ensemble standout in the original series of movies, she too is in this revival, bringing a pained humanity to Miranda Hobbs in even the show's most patently absurd moments. Nixon, who also directed one of the season's episodes, gives a phenomenal performance as Miranda, painting a picture of a woman struggling to conquer her crippling alcoholism while wrestling with her sexuality. While the character writing wasn't always great or even that good, Nixon did everything possible to make it work and was the season's single saving grace. Number 4. Viola Davis in How to Get Away with Murder. Is there a more hilariously blatant example of an incredible actor pimping their talents out on a wretched procedural series than Viola Davis in the utterly ridiculous legal thriller show How to Get Away with Murder? Now, to be completely fair, the series was relatively entertaining for a season or two, but by the time it reached its 6th and final season, it had completely collapsed under the weight of its own laughably convoluted storytelling. It's so clearly a show that didn't have long-term mileage in it, yet because the ratings remained high enough, it was run aggressively into the ground while the writers clearly had no compelling ideas left in the tank. And yet, those solid ratings can largely be attributed to Viola Davis, who gave such a composed and magnetic performance in even the most poorly written episode. While it was obviously a paycheck gig to fund Davis's less lucrative art house film projects, especially in its later seasons, Davis laudably didn't just phone her work in and fall asleep at the wheel. She continued to give an acting clinic while probably fundamentally aware she was starring in pure dreck. Number 3. Chris Pratt in The Terminal List. It's fair to say that the internet has a real hate boner for Chris Pratt at the moment, enough that many might struggle to appreciate the sublime work he put into his new Amazon action thriller series The Terminal List. The problem, ostensibly, is that the show is a painfully by-the-numbers revenge series, the kind of which we've seen so many times before. As an 8-part series, it feels painfully drawn out, as so many streaming shows are these days, while tying itself up in needlessly convoluted storytelling knots to sustain said length. It is, despite its focus on realistic gunplay, a shockingly boring show at times, albeit one in which Pratt is giving 110% as US Navy SEAL James Reese. Given Pratt's tendency towards comedic fare, it's neat to see him in a dead serious role like this, and he absolutely nails it. It's a far cry from Andy Dwyer or Star-Lord and shows audiences that Pratt can absolutely commit to a tortured, bloodthirsty character and be totally believable while doing so. It's just a shame the show surrounding him is such formulaic, exhaustingly bloated nonsense. Number 2. Jenna Ortega in Wednesday. A possibly controversial opinion here, given that reviews for Tim Burton's new Addams Family series Wednesday were broadly positive, and it scored record-breaking numbers for Netflix. But would the show really be anything at all without Jenna Ortega? Rising star Ortega does a frankly heroic job portraying Wednesday Addams, at once paying homage to Christina Ricci's gloriously deadpan performance from the 1990s films, but also bringing enough of her own singularly sardonic tenor to the table. Ortega isn't merely the anchor holding the show in place, she is the show, basically because without her it would be so incredibly difficult to stomach the assault of crusty young adult teen drama tropes and dull murder mystery slop. Though well made, Wednesday scales back the gothic vibe of the source material in favour of a more generic fantasy style that can't help but feel rather cynical. Were a lesser actor in the title role, it'd be even more of a chore to make it to the end of the overplotted 8-episode first season. Ortega clearly put in the work to do the character justice, but deserved much stronger material to work with. One can only hope that season 2 might try a little harder, but given those ratings, the showrunners clearly won't feel like they need to. Number 1. Ari Graynor in Bad Teacher. Though Hollywood is obsessed with adapting every moderately successful movie into its own long-running TV series, there are honestly far more offensive ideas than translating the hit 2011 Cameron Diaz starring comedy film Bad Teacher into a show. The short-lived 2014 series starred Ari Graynor as Meredith Davis, a gold-digging former housewife who poses as a high school teacher in the hope of finding a wealthy divorcee to marry. It's a decent enough setup, yet not one which the show does anything interesting with, resorting to the most pat, predictable, sentimental sitcom storytelling, while lacking the ribald R-rated edge that made the movie such a hoot. The single saving grace is lead Ari Graynor, an extremely appealing actress who has cornered the market on playing sloppy train wrecks over the years, yet hasn't ever quite received a mainstream project worthy of her skills. Even so, she gives a full-throated and completely persuasive performance as Meredith, albeit one that's squandered on trash-tier writing in an overly sanitized adaptation of the film. Had this been on a more permissive network like HBO or Showtime and secured the talents of more imaginative writers, it's easy to picture it having been a hit and propelling Graynor to sure stardom. And that concludes our list. If you think we missed any, then do let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.